When CCS asked me to speak on accountability, and I looked at this session explanation, it said fixing up accountability in the system. And the immediate question that came to my mind is that, does accountability even exist? What are we trying to fix? The question really is maybe introduction of an accountability framework for the system. So I don't know where to start. Quite honestly, there is such a wide variety of conversations we could have. I don't want to even pretend to be an expert on the subject. I think there are a lot of people sitting here who probably are much more better equipped to speak on the topic, but I just have some ideas which I'd like to share. And in preparing for this, I wanted to go back to a study that McKinsey and Company did in 2007, I believe, if I'm correct, which is what I'm just going to show you. Most of you may have seen the study, but nevertheless, I tried to pull this slide together, which will help walk through and maybe give you a sense of what I'm trying to present and why. So if you remember, in 2007, McKinsey had done this study across, I think, 20 countries across the world, where they said, what are the interventions that are being applied in the world's most improved school systems? So they looked at these 20 countries. I think Madhya Pradesh was part of that study as well. So they had not looked at countries, but they had looked at specific districts. They had looked at charter school systems. They had looked at full countries as well. So it was fairly comprehensive. And they broke up those countries into essentially 4 categories based on where the country's school system was. So the 4 categories are poor to fair. So is there a poor system that is on the journey to moving to fair? Is there a fair system on the journey to moving to good? Is there a good system on the journey to moving to great? And is there a great system on the journey moving to excellent? So those are the 4 categories. What I want to focus on really is the first 2 categories, the poor to fair and the fair to good. I think most of us would argue that India probably falls in maybe the first bucket. Some here may say it falls in the second bucket. So basis that, if you look at the intervention clusters, what are the interventions? And what they studied was they interviewed 200 different people and organizations and looked at 600 different interventions that had taken place in these 20 countries. And basis that, they arrived at these intervention clusters. So if you look at the poor to fair intervention clusters, they're really talking about motivation and scaffolding of low-skilled teachers. So here you're talking about scripted materials, right? You're talking about coaching on curriculum. You're talking about spending time on task. School visits by the center, if a center is efficient. Incentives for high-performing teachers and high-performing schools. Then they talk about getting all schools to a minimum quality level. So they're talking about outcome targets. Those have been well defined. What are we trying to achieve as a school system? That we have a certain outcome. And here is where I want you to focus on the accountability debate that we'll come to in the second slide. Additional support for low-performing schools. Again, an accountability framework that can respond to a performance deficit.
Pay attention to what the data is saying and work towards that. Teacher accountability is...
Indian government definitely does focus on that. Provision of textbooks, again, easy to do, and we are doing it. Getting students into seats, so expanding accessibility, we've done that with the MDGs. Improving attendance, we've done that with the MDGs. That's really what countries that are moving from poor systems to fair systems typically do. Right? That's what the study stated. Now let's move to the second column, which is what do countries that have been in the fair category of performance do if they want to move to the good category of performance? Which is where the theme really is putting that foundation in place. I believe that's where we need to be. That's where I think we can make recommendations to government. So the intervention cluster there is around data and accountability. You're creating transparency to schools and or public on school performance. So you're actually making this data available, right, to the Aam Janta. You're doing inspections of schools. So these are independent inspections. These are not only necessarily self-evaluations, but these are independent inspections being done by either a third-party agency or government organizations. You're focusing on the financial and organizational foundation. So decentralizing financial and administrative rights, increasing funding, giving more money, redesigning organizations, and then focusing on the pedagogical foundation. So looking at what should be the language of instruction, what should be the school model, and so on and so forth. Now, without going to good to great and great to excellent, because I don't think we're there, so it may not be relevant yet, just look at the bottom. It's hard to read, but I'll try and tell you what the common threads were across all these 4 different buckets. And that's what's very interesting when we talk about accountability. So the 6 interventions that were pretty much common across the 4 categories was, one was revising a curriculum and standards. So we're actually defining standards, right? And if we look at most of our industries across the country, we've got organizations, whether it's the BIS or the FSSAI, or you've got ratings for hotels, or you look at the food sector or the chemical sector or the manufacturing sector, we've got standards pretty well defined, right? And there's accreditation for it. I don't know if that's very well defined in the Indian context yet, right? And if there are standards, the standards as defined by RTE probably need to be relooked at. Second point is reviewing remuneration and the reward structure. So is there a performance-linked pay structure, or are we just paying teachers? And I know there's been studies been done on teacher incentives and how that leads to improvement or not. But that's another common thread across these 4 different categories. The third is building technical skills of teachers and principals in order to address the challenges that you face when you inspect a school system. The fourth is assessing student learning. And again, assessing student learning is being done in a standardized manner. So we participated in a standardized assessment 6 years ago. Today we're standing here talking about national education policy, we're talking about revisions. I think it's very important we look at what we've done over the last 65 years, but also look at the data that's available out there, right? What's worked in countries that look similar to ours, what hasn't worked in countries that's similar to ours, and then think about a national education policy. I think the 4-member team or the 5-member team that's drafting this report is going to get inputs from, I believe, 300,000 different people. I don't know how you synthesize that much information and then make sense of it. It's going to be hard. So I'll just move to the second slide, and this is where I'm saying it's a recommendation. It's something I think we need to ponder over, think through, and there are a lot of people here who are running schools, who are part of the school system. It's worth debating whether this makes sense. It's a recommendation. I'm not the expert, but I'm just throwing it out there. So if we have to build an accountability framework, I look at this in the form of an accountability triangle, right? And I'll build the triangle. So the first piece of that triangle is around data collection and monitoring, right? Very clear standards for learning. And here, what I'm focusing on accountability is really keeping the student in mind, because that's what the agenda said. That's what the topic said. Our most important stakeholder, the student, and the student's parent. And quite honestly, I think we can achieve a lot, but at the end of the day, a student is not learning. I don't know what good we're doing for that. Yes, of course, I'm not saying this is just cognitive development. It's across the board. We can define learning in multiple ways, but if the child is not learning in school, then is school fulfilling what it's there for? So clear standards for learning and aligned student assessment. So we're evaluating the school system across the board, all schools, right? Whether it's a government school or a private school or a recognized school or an aided school, doesn't matter. Every school has a standardized system of assessments. The second is an established set of quality standards for the school. Right? So we're not just looking at the student data, but what's happening in the classroom, what's happening around teaching and learning, what's happening with management, what's happening with the leadership, what does the infrastructure look like? We spoke about infrastructure and the importance thereof. So a school quality assessment. Most importantly, timely and quality data collection. A lot of the times we're actually not being able to collect data in such a way that we can act on the data and take necessary decisions for the following subsequent academic year. So that's one, is the data collection and the monitoring. Very, very critical element. I think it's happening, but let's see if it actually completes the triangle in the way it's happening. There are some states who've done a good job in collecting data, but I'm not sure what that data is doing. It's sitting there. I've actually been part of many state initiatives where I've seen reams and reams and reams of paper where it's just sitting there. Government doesn't even know what to do with it because it's not digital, it's not accessible, it cannot be used. Second part of that triangle is an internal and an external analysis of the data. What does that mean? A robust self-assessment. I think you all are best placed to judge for yourselves. And in the previous session, I think I heard people saying that on autonomy, let the school decide what it needs to do. So do a self-evaluation on the basis of the data that you've just collected. And be ready to hold yourself accountable, right? Second, let's validate that through an external, call it an inspection or call it a monitoring system. Ideally, this should be done independent of the government. If you look at the UK context, there's an independent agency called Ofsted that does the evaluation for every one of the 27,000 schools in that country, right? And it's independent of the government. It's funded by the Treasury, but it's independent of the government. It does not sit within the Department for Education. So setting up something like that. The third is a cross-school analysis. So are my children in my school performing better than children in your school? Are the children in grade 3 in this school in Haryana performing at par with grade 3 children in this school in Madhya Pradesh? I should be able to make some sense of that if I know that there is a standard level children need to reach at every grade. It shouldn't be that hard. And now moving to completing that triangle. You've done the data collection, you've done the internal and the external validation. Now you know how to use the data and decide what interventions you want. And I think this is where it's very important for a school system, whether it is a district, DICE, or it is an SCRT, or it is a state, or it is the MHRD. This is the data that needs to feed from bottom up for government and these states and bodies to take decisions on what they need to do. So A, make the data public. Let it be out there on what every school is doing. Why should we be hiding what we do, right? We're accountable to the public, we're accountable to parents and students. Our data should be made public, including government schools. Information from the system used to inform school improvement and action planning. So this is not about punitive measures to say that school is really bad, they're really underperforming, shut them down. It's more to say that school is failing in a few areas, needs improvement, let's equip them with the necessary tools and skills and help them improve, right? And as I showed you in the previous slide, create a system that allows them to do that. It will be hard, this is not happening overnight, but these are the things that we need to work towards. Create an incentive structure for performance. So rather than saying 6th pay commission, 7th pay commission, 8th pay commission endlessly, can we institute a culture of performance, linking performance to pay potentially? And a comprehensive system of supports and interventions for low-performing schools. So here is where you're going to get a categorization, and the UK has done an interesting thing which I quote specifically, which is where my organization is trying to work in India, is they define 4 different types of schools. Either there's an excellent school, a good school, a fair school, or an underperforming school. And those that are in special measures which need improvement, the government says this management in this school can't fix itself, it should become an academy. An academy essentially is bringing in people from the non-profit private sector who get funded by the government to run this school, right? And they've got 4,000 such academies. I believe half of the secondary schools in the United Kingdom are academies. I may be wrong slightly on the number, but I believe it's a very large number. So essentially, we're looking at how we can react to each school at different levels.